am Olivia Morgan, 27 years old, a lawyer. But right now, I'm not fighting in a courtroom. I'm fighting at this front door, against my own family. My grandparents left behind a $3 million inheritance. My parents and my sister showed up with smiles on their faces. Then my father shoved forged documents in my face. "This house is in my name now," he said. "Get out by Friday." Even as I heard those words, I kept smiling. Did you really think I'd let that happen? A black SUV pulled up in the driveway. My mother's perfume. My sister's footsteps approaching the entrance. Behind them, a moving truck, like a caravan of plunder. But I had already decided. I would not give up this house my grandparents loved. Not 1 inch. I remember what my grandfather once told me. "Olivia, family is not bound by blood. It's bound by integrity." I stood on the porch and looked at them quietly. Today, what would be tested was not blood ties, but trust. If your family tried to steal your loved one's inheritance, what would you do? An unimaginable twist awaits her next. Tell me in the comments how you would stand up to this. I am Olivia Morgan, a 27-year-old lawyer, but the enemy in this battle wasn't in the courtroom. It was my own family, the ones who wanted my grandparents' inheritance. My grandfather Harold and grandmother Martha had raised me since I was 5. My parents, Richard and Elaine, moved to a distant state for work. In reality, they were just chasing freedom and money. My grandparents' home was an old Victorian mansion in Boston's historic district, passed down through 3 generations. The house and multiple real estate investments totaled over $3 million. But to me, it wasn't just about the money. This house was the place where I learned about love and integrity. Every morning, my grandmother baked muffins. "Come on, wake up, little lawyer," she'd say with a laugh. My grandfather taught me to fish. He valued time spent reading. In the evenings, the two of them would sit side by side in the old library, reading. The sound of turning pages. The crackling of the fireplace. I've never known another moment so quiet and warm. My grandfather often said, "Olivia, a promise is life itself. Break it, and you can never buy it back." My grandmother would add with a smile, "Stand on your own 2 feet. A life supported by others will eventually collapse." Those teachings took deep root in me, but my parents walked a completely opposite path. My father failed in business and went bankrupt twice. My mother was busy chasing get-rich-quick dreams, miracle diet pills, timeshare resorts. They only visited the house when they were in trouble. They'd show up with smiles, beg for money with tears. When they left, they'd say, "I'll pay you back next time," and disappear. They never paid back a single cent. My sister Valerie, 7 years younger than me, grew up watching them. From a young age, she learned to cry to get what she wanted. In her teens, she mastered manipulating people's hearts. Even when she took bills from grandmother's purse, tears would earn her forgiveness. My grandparents believed in her, but each time, my chest felt uneasy. It was a premonition that would one day turn into a great betrayal. As my grandparents grew older, phone calls from my father and mother became more frequent. "The house must be getting difficult, right? Have you thought about a nursing home?" They pretended to be helpful while probing the value of the house. Every time my grandparents' health worsened, their visits increased. When I entered the room, their whispered conversations would stop. That silence was more ominous than anything. I studied law in college while continuing to care for my grandparents. I chose a local university to keep tuition costs down with scholarships. The reason was simple. I wanted to be close to them. Every time I heard my grandfather cough in the middle of the night, the word protect became real to me. In high school, I heard about an elderly couple in the neighborhood whose son had stolen their assets, leaving them bankrupt. The documents they signed, supposedly for their son to manage on their behalf, were actually transfer agreements. While watching the news, my grandmother murmured, "Blood ties aren't always safe, are they?" That's when I made up my mind. I would protect everything about my grandparents. In college, I specialized in elder law and asset protection. One professor, Winters, said something I'll never forget. It's not strangers who steal from the elderly, it's family. And that betrayal leaves the deepest wounds. My chest went cold. It felt like someone had predicted my future. After graduation, I visited a trusted lawyer, Nancy Hoffman, without my grandparents knowing. Your parents' behavior requires caution, Nancy said, looking at documents. If you establish a trust, you can protect your grandparents' assets according to their wishes, but you need their signatures. That night, with trembling hands, I brought it up to my grandparents. Grandpa, Grandma, there's a way to protect this house and assets through a trust. My grandfather frowned. Richard has his problems, but he wouldn't steal from us. My grandmother asked while fidgeting with her ring. Why would you think such a thing? I carefully chose my words and showed them the email my father had sent to a real estate agent. Tell me the market price in this area and the possible sale amount. Tears welled up in my grandmother's eyes. 5 years ago, I lent him $50,000. He said, it's a business opportunity. I need it right now. But when I asked about repayment, he yelled, you're rich, so what does it matter? My grandfather silently removed his trembling glasses. Show me those trust documents again. 3 days later, we visited Nancy's office and established the Morgan Family Trust. My grandparents would retain full rights while alive. After their passing, I would manage it as trustee. The house and investments were now protected by my grandparents' wishes. Only Nancy, my grandparents, and I knew about it. We told my parents nothing. I let out a small breath of relief in my chest. Finally, I could feel safe, but within that quiet relief, an inaudible sound before the storm was certainly echoing. The day the trust was finalized, my grandfather was unusually quiet. On the drive home from the office, he stared out the window the whole time. The sunset was turning the brick buildings golden. My grandmother reached from the passenger seat and gently held his fingers. Now we can rest easy, she smiled, but deep in her voice, profound sadness seeped through. The reality of having to admit they couldn't trust their son. How painful that must have been for them. I couldn't put into words. A few months later, my grandfather's health began to change. He was easily out of breath. His complexion was poor. At first, I thought it was his heart condition worsening, but the hospital test results were beyond imagination. It's terminal pancreatic cancer. Life expectancy is 3 to 6 months. The doctor's voice seemed to echo from far away. My grandmother's hands trembled. My grandfather simply nodded quietly. I see. Then I must use the remaining time properly. Those words were strangely calm, as if he had prepared himself for the final trial of his life. However, that news quickly reached those people's ears. My parents, Richard and Elaine, the two who hadn't shown their faces for 6 months, suddenly began visiting frequently. As if summoned, my mother took my grandfather's hand with tears in her eyes. Father-in-law, just in case, you should organize your assets. Her tone wasn't concern. It was more like confirmation. My grandfather didn't answer. He just looked at the cherry blossoms in the garden. My sister Valerie also came, saying she'd help with care. But what she actually did was count jewelry in grandmother's bedroom. She'd flip through old albums and mutter, I wonder if this could sell. My grandmother could no longer scold her. The progression of illness and sorrow had drained the strength from her heart. During that time, I was balancing work and caregiving with almost no time to sleep. Still, every time I saw my grandparents smile, the word protect lit a lamp in my heart. One such night, when I went down to the kitchen to get my grandfather's medicine, I heard low voices from the garden. Outside the window, my father and mother were talking. In the cold night air, I could hear their words clearly. Once Harold is gone, we move immediately. Martha's already confused. Show her some papers and she'll sign anything. But what about Olivia? She's a lawyer. She's just a kid. No experience. We'll give her some money to keep quiet. If she resists, We'll sue her for undue influence. She was living with them. People will think she manipulated them." My mother laughed in a muffled voice. That's the kind of story the media loves. In that instant, I couldn't breathe. My blood relatives were plotting to trap me. It sounded as if my own parents were strangers. I felt like I was in a nightmare. The trust I'd built to protect my grandparents was about to be used as material to make me the enemy. The next morning, I called Nancy Hoffman with trembling hands. "They've started moving, just as we predicted." After a brief silence, Nancy answered in a calm voice. "It's all right, Olivia. The trust is complete, but protect your grandmother. What they are after is a confused elderly person's signature." As I listened to those words, I looked around my grandparents' living room. Family photos on the walls, a young me laughing with my grandparents, and beside them, my father with his eyes downcast. That composition told the truth more than anything else. My grandfather's condition worsened day by day. Still, he never complained. One night, he gripped my hand, with an oxygen tube attached. He spoke in a raspy voice. "Olivia, promise me. Protect this house. Protect Martha. Richard only sees what he wants. This house isn't property. It's proof that we lived. If we lose it, this family truly ends." I couldn't stop the tears. I could only nod over and over. "I promise. I'll definitely protect it." My grandfather smiled faintly. "I knew you'd say that," he whispered. 3 days later, my grandfather passed away peacefully, as if cradled in his wife's arms, peaceful and quiet. My grandmother clung to his hand, crying. "Why don't you rest a little?" I suggested. She shook her head slightly. "I want to stay with him a little longer." The day of the funeral, the sky was clear. My father and mother arrived 20 minutes late. My mother wore a flashy black dress with gold accessories. My father showed off an expensive watch peeking from the cuffs of his new suit. Their inappropriate glamour made everyone look away. In front of my grandfather's casket, my father patted my shoulder lightly. "Hey, Olivia, what's happening with the will?" I answered coldly, still being processed. "Don't worry." My father nodded. "I see. Then let's get it done as soon as possible." There wasn't a trace of grief in his tone. After the funeral, my grandmother's shoulders sagged. Deep loneliness dwelled in her eyes. Not just the sorrow of losing my grandfather, but the eyes of a mother who had completely lost faith in her son. That night, I sat alone in my grandfather's study and opened an old notebook. There was a short memo he'd left during his lifetime. "A home is a person's anchor for the heart. Give it to those who seek money, and even the heart will break." I traced that sentence with my finger and made a vow. I will definitely protect this house. In the days that followed, my grandmother's dementia gradually progressed. Sometimes she'd mistake me for my mother. "Elaine, call him. It's dinner time." I'd smile and answer, "Yes, Grandpa will be right back." That lie was the only way to protect my grandmother's heart. At night, I continued writing in my journal. My grandmother's condition, my parents' actions, my grandfather's words, and my own emotions. With each page, I felt that this record would someday become evidence. In the quiet house, the sound of the clock's hands echoed. My grandfather's voice was no longer there, but that promise was still alive. I knew this was only the beginning of the storm. After losing my grandfather, the house looked different somehow. That warm air had thinned. Only silence remained. My grandmother Martha visibly weakened after my grandfather's death. Her appetite dropped. She smiled less. Sometimes she'd stare blankly out the window, as if searching for my grandfather's figure there. I switched to remote work between jobs, increasing the time I spent by my grandmother's side. While assisting her, I'd handle legal cases in my grandfather's study. At night, we'd watch old movies together. I'd read aloud Jane Austen novels that my grandmother loved. Only during those times did she seem to regain her smile a little. But by the time a season had passed, my grandmother's body had reached its limit. Her chronic heart disease, compounded by pneumonia, The doctor told me it would be best for her to spend her time peacefully at home. Without hesitation, I chose to care for her at home as she wished. The sound of the oxygen machine constantly echoed in the room. Sometimes my grandmother would hold my hand and smile. Did Harold go out? Yes, he'll be back soon. When I answered that way, she'd close her eyes with relief. As I repeated that exchange many times, I understood. This lie was a form of kindness. Then one evening, my grandmother suddenly spoke in a clear tone. Olivia, you are our pride. Protect this house. No matter what anyone says, you are right. I nodded, holding back tears. That night, my grandmother quietly passed away, as if embraced by my grandfather, peaceful and quiet. The funeral was small. Neighbors and church friends gathered to pray quietly, but my father, mother, and sister were nowhere to be seen. Instead, what arrived was a bouquet of white lilies and a businesslike card from the family, not even a signature. That coldness squeezed my chest more than the scent of flowers. After the funeral, I was alone. The sound of the clock in the house echoed unusually loud. In my grandparents' bedroom, I could still feel their warmth, but loneliness and silence pressed in. I sat in front of my grandparents' photo. This is really the end, isn't it? I murmured, but deep in my heart, I knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. That premonition became reality 2 weeks later. Sunday morning, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find my father, mother, and sister Valerie. All three wore expressions like stage actors. My mother hugged me with tears welling up. Olivia, how awful. Mom is so sad. The thinness of those words left me speechless. My father raised the corners of his mouth and patted my shoulder lightly. This is when family helps each other, right? Without even taking off his shoes, he boldly entered the house. His eyes moved as if appraising paintings and furniture. They paused for a moment on grandmother's heirloom silverware. My sister Valerie stood in the entryway, looking around the room. Was this house always this big? It would sell for a lot. At her casual remark, my father laughed. Hey, you shouldn't say things like that. But his lips couldn't hide the color of expectation. I guided them to the living room and served the coffee and pastries I'd prepared. My father settled deep into his chair and suddenly got to the point. Hey, did you see Mom's will? She left one, right? Yes, I'm managing everything. I see. Then show it to me once the arrangements are done. For what purpose? Isn't it obvious? For asset distribution. It's family property, so it needs to be fair. My mother nodded while putting on a theatrical, gentle voice. Olivia, it must be hard for you to live in this house alone, right? You're young, so you should move to an apartment in the city. If we sell it, it'll be good money. This house is included in my grandparents' trust. There are no plans to sell it. In that instant, my mother's face stiffened. Valerie pouted her lips. Huh? What's a trust? Does that mean it's all yours? Isn't that unfair? Unfair? I laughed. It's to protect it. From people like you. Silence flowed. My father stood up and pulled an old envelope from his pocket. Then how do you explain this? Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper. This is the official will your grandparents wrote long ago. It says all assets go to me, the eldest son. I took the paper and glanced at it. Bleeding ink. An unnatural line in the signature. I knew immediately. It was fake. You think that's real? Of course. My father's voice grew rough. We had a lawyer verify it. It's legally valid. So get out of this house by Friday. In the living room where the lingering scent of my grandmother's perfume drifted, I slowly stood up. Fine. I'd like to see what kind of lawyer you hired. If they really understand the law. My mother lost her words. My father's hands trembled. In that moment, I was certain. This was the final battle to test my grandparents' will. My enemy wasn't blood ties. It was greed itself. The night I received threats from my family, I spread all of my grandparents' documents on the desk and checked them one by one. The fluorescent light illuminated the contract papers in pale blue. Bank trust accounts. Original signatures of my grandparents. Backup discs of video recordings. This will be our last line of defense. The email from Nancy contained emergency legal procedures listed point by point. I also contacted lawyer Jake Thompson to set up a meeting for the court date. The forged will my father thrust at me at the front door. In that instant, something switched inside me. There was no more fear or sadness, only quiet determination. My grandfather had said, "Stay true to integrity. That's the only shield that protects a person." With those words in my heart, I slowly pushed the envelope back against my father's chest. "You still don't know the meaning of family." My mother's eyes wavered for a moment at my voice, but her cold smile quickly returned. "Laws and trusts just excuses to hoard all the money for yourself." Valerie nodded beside her. "That's right. Being a lawyer is just cheating." I listened to their words while realizing their understanding stops at money. As soon as they left, I contacted Nancy. They finally made their move. It's a forged will. I heard the sound of papers rustling on the other end. I thought they would. "Don't worry, we are prepared." Nancy's voice was always calm, like a small light glowing in the darkness. The two of us silently compared documents over Zoom, confirming repeatedly that there was no room for forgery. Nancy said, "Make copies of the security camera footage and store them in 3 places. One in an offline safe, one in the cloud, one at my office." Olivia nodded while staring into the darkness outside. The distant streetlights blurred. The deeper the night grew, the harder her resolve became. Sleepless nights weren't frightening if it meant protecting my grandparents' honor. Late at night, when I collapsed on the desk after organizing documents, my smartphone vibrated. The screen showed Dad. Not a call, but a voice message. With a bad feeling, I played it. A familiar low voice flowed out. "Olivia, you seem to think you're right, but this house and money are all mine. Listen, I'm your father. If you defy me, you'll regret it." The voice grew rougher, like a beast trying to reclaim control. "You embarrassed me. I don't care if you're a lawyer or whatever. You'll regret making me your enemy. I have connections and money. I can easily ruin your career." After silence, only breathing remained. "Get out by Friday." That's the end of it. The message cut off. Olivia stared at the phone, suppressing the trembling of her fingertips. But no tears came. Instead, a quiet flame ignited in her heart. "I won't be threatened by anyone anymore." She backed up the message to the cloud, forwarded it to Nancy, then turned off the phone. Outside, rain began to fall, rhythmically drumming on the roof. The night felt long, but determination prevailed over fear. To protect my grandparents' house, she thought she could stand even in any darkness. From the next morning, I began sorting through my grandparents' belongings. In the desk drawers of the study, several notes written in my grandfather's handwriting remained. "Lent money to Richard." The promise of repayment was broken 3 times. Martha cried. She said she could no longer trust her son. The writing was faded, but it was evidence itself that spoke the truth. Between the pages of my grandmother's old album, a duplicate of the trust agreement and a thank you letter with my grandparents' signatures were tucked in. It read, "With gratitude to Olivia for respecting our wishes." I clutched that paper, unable to stop my tears. "I will use the shield you left me." A few days later, a thick envelope arrived in the mailbox. Inside was a notice of inheritance rights confirmation lawsuit. The sender was my father, Richard Morgan. They had officially sued me. They chose to drag family into court. At Nancy's office, I opened the complaint. It stated, "The defendant manipulated elderly parents and improperly established a trust agreement," as if I were a con artist. Nancy laughed quietly. As expected, they're the type to dig their own graves. She placed a thick file on her desk. "These are excerpts from the journal you kept, email histories, and doctor's diagnoses. All of it proves your integrity." I took a deep breath and nodded. Let's do this. For my grandparents. The day of the trial. The courtroom air was cold and tense. In front of me sat my father, mother, Valerie, and the flashy lawyer they'd hired. My father began testifying calmly. As the defendant's father, I witnessed her actions. She isolated my parents and pushed the family away. Every word was a lie, but I said nothing. Nancy had taught me, silence is the greatest rebuttal. The opposing lawyer pressed further. The defendant used caregiving as a pretext to control her parents and established a trust under her name. The courtroom stirred. In the midst of that, Nancy stood up quietly. Your Honor, please examine this evidence. Displayed on the screen was video footage of my grandparents signing. It was filmed with Nancy present, not me. My grandfather, holding a pen, said, I entrust this house to Olivia. She is our pride. When that voice played, the courtroom's atmosphere completely changed. My father's face contorted. My mother's hands trembled. Valerie shouted, I don't believe it. Nancy continued quietly. As the courtroom tension peaked, Nancy slowly stood up. Behind her sat legal assistant Sophia, paralegal Mike, and trust notary Edward. In front of each of them sat thick files. The mountain of prepared evidence would quietly corner my father and his lies. Your Honor, please refer to evidence number 17. What Sophia pointed to was the bank's signature record. My grandparents' signatures were recorded with date, location, and time, all witnessed by notary Edward. He took the witness stand and spoke in a calm voice. I witnessed the signatures for this trust agreement as the official witness. This document is genuine, with no room for tampering. Next, Mike submitted the forensic analysis results of the paper my father had presented as a will. The printing toner was from different time periods. The signature section had different pen pressure and ink components detected. In other words, the signature was added later. Mike stated definitively. The courtroom air froze. My father wouldn't raise his face. My mother gripped the back of her hand, trembling. For the first time, fear colored Valerie's eyes. Nancy quietly added, the plaintiff's purpose is not inheritance, but seizure. The defendant honored her parents and protected her grandparents' wishes by establishing a trust through legal procedures. What distorted it was family greed. Furthermore, please look at this. The screen switched to show an email my father had sent to his lawyer. Check if we can forge evidence. Murmurs spread. The opposing lawyer stood up and shouted, Objection. The judge calmly replied, Objection overruled. My father covered his face. My mother began to cry. Valerie stood up from her chair. Dad, what's going on? She yelled. In that instant, the mask-called family crumbled with a sound. I simply closed my eyes, remembering the photograph of my grandparents' portrait. Finally, the truth had been told. The moment Nancy closed her materials, the tense courtroom air seemed to snap and relax. Everyone understood. The outcome of this battle would never be overturned. Olivia sat in her seat, taking a deep breath. In her heart, she heard her grandparents' voices. Don't be afraid to speak the truth. Integrity will always be rewarded. The day of the verdict, the courtroom was silent. The trust agreement is valid, and the plaintiff's intent to forge and defraud is recognized. The judge's words echoed. In that moment, I held my breath. More than the sense of winning, relief filled my heart that my grandparents' honor had been protected. Evening light illuminated the living room floor. Standing in front of my grandparents' photo, I smiled softly. It's over. I kept your promise. The cherry tree swayed in the wind. A single petal fell on my shoulder. In the silence, I finally understood. Family is not blood, but bonds you choose. Those who abandon integrity lose their family. Only those who uphold integrity can reclaim their lives. And spring arrived in my heart, too. A few days had passed since the verdict. Spring light streamed through the stained glass of my grandparents' house. The long winter had ended. The air by the window finally felt soft. I was organizing the documents piled on the living room table one by one. Official trust registration, asset redistribution, legal reports. There was no time to bask in the afterglow of victory. Reality's procedures kept pressing in one after another. The police patrolled around the house for a while. Newspapers and the internet briefly carried reports of my father's forgery case, but I threw them away without opening them. There's no need to chase the past anymore. The silence of the house my grandparents left was the best answer. That afternoon, I received a call from the district attorney's office. "We can prosecute your father for fraud and document forgery. If you wish, we'd like your testimony." The voice on the other end was businesslike. I was silent for a while, staring at the steaming tea. My grandfather's words came back to me. "Righteousness is sometimes cold. Integrity saves people." "No, thank you." When I answered that, the weight in my chest suddenly dissolved. Justice had been served. There was no need to punish anyone further. If my grandparents were alive, I think they would have made the same choice. I entered my grandmother's study and placed my hand on the desk. An old diary remained there. "Live with integrity. Be a person who keeps promises." It was written in shaky letters. I gently closed the pages and smiled quietly. I kept it properly. I restored my grandparents' house and planted new seedlings in the flower bed my grandmother left. Each time I touched the soil, their voices came back. "Be honest, even if you're alone." The next morning, the tulips in the garden had all bloomed at once. The flowers my grandfather planted and my grandmother talked to every day, swaying in the spring breeze. They reflected light like new life. I put on gloves and dug up the flower bed soil. From the cold earth, small buds were emerging. "You're strong, aren't you?" Just then, the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, Valerie was standing there. Her once flashy clothing was subdued. In her hands, she clutched a small bouquet. I wanted to see Grandma's flower bed. Her voice trembled. I nodded silently and led her to the garden. Valerie knelt and touched the tulip flowers. "Hey, Olivia." I really didn't know what was right back then. I answered quietly. "I know. People learn from mistakes." She kept her head down and shed tears. "Sis, I'm sorry." I paused for a moment and smiled. "If you're apologizing, protect the next someone. That will be your real I'm sorry." Valerie nodded and placed the bouquet in front of my grandmother's photo. Wind blew through. The scent of flowers passed between us. Evening. An envelope had arrived in the mailbox at the entrance. The sender was Nancy Hoffman. Inside was a letter and a copy of a new contract. "The establishment of the new trust under your name, the Morgan Legacy Fund, has been approved. Its purpose is legal support for the elderly. Your experience will save the next someone." I held that letter to my chest and exhaled quietly. The battle to protect my grandparents' house was over. From now on, a life dedicated to protecting someone else's house would begin. At night, before turning off the living room lights, I stood in front of my grandparents' photo. "It's over. I protected all of your wishes." The cherry tree swayed in the wind. Petals tapped the window. I understood. Family is not blood, but bonds of integrity you choose. Those who steal leave loneliness behind. Those who protect nurture the future. And spring arrived in my heart, too. The courage to stand up to injustice and the strength to forgive. Someone with both becomes hope for the next person. If this story resonated with you, tell me in the comments. Someone is waiting for your story of renewal.